Hello students, this video is being recorded in the summer of 2020, right after the end of the spring semester and in the midst of the ongoing COVID-19 pandemic. Since we do not yet know for sure what format our classes will take in the fall, and since there's some likelihood that at least some of us, both students and faculty, will have to be away from campus for a time should the mitigation plans prove ineffective, or should compliance with or enforcement of public health guidelines prove impossible, I am preparing a video version of each of my lectures for the class to have it ready if and when it is needed. It's also the case that necessary distancing requirements in the classrooms may make it impossible that the entire class can be in the same room at the same time. In that case, those whose turn it is to stay away from campus may find these video lectures a better option than relying on a live classroom feed via Zoom or some other technology. So if you're watching this video, it means that we are, for reasons of public and personal health, still unable to meet together in a traditional face-to-face classroom format. All the same, I'll continue to do my best to teach you what I know with whatever tools I have at my disposal. Enjoy the lecture. So we will continue our discussion of deductive reasoning and actually move a little bit beyond the formal properties of syllogisms and back into natural language arguments, where we will begin our investigation into discovering missing premises. One of the things we know about the way people argue is that they rarely use formal deductive reasoning. That is, people don't argue with syllogisms. Syllogisms are kind of an abstraction of the reasoning that takes place in normal or natural language discourse. And so we still want to be able to apply what we know about the formal reasoning that occurs in syllogisms, and then we can use our understanding, for instance, of the rules of inference to generate parts of the argument that may be unstated or implicit in natural language discourse. And that's what this study of missing premises will enable us to do. So we're going to use the rules of inference now that we've learned them and applied them to the analysis of syllogisms in standard logical form. We'll use those rules of inference to help us analyze and critique natural language arguments. So we use the rules of inference for a valid syllogism to generate the missing premise in natural language arguments. That missing premise often represents an unstated or implicit warrant in natural language reasoning. And the ability to discover that implicit inference statement is an important critical tool in the analysis of public discourse, whether you're doing a critical analysis of a famous speech, or you're observing what's going on in a political campaign and studying the implicit argument that exists in campaign ads, for example. You'll want to be able to figure out all the parts of the argument, including the implicit inference statements that are at work in the reasoning process. And we can use the rules of inference to do that, to find the missing premise. Discovery of these missing premises in a public argument can lead us to actually assemble a whole cluster of statements that represent the unstated principles or values at work in a discourse. So especially if you have a lengthy discourse or a series of discourses, for instance, in a campaign, by examining and analyzing the missing premises, you learn a great deal about what the arguer, the writer, or the speaker takes for granted, both as the fundamental values or ideals at work in his or her argument, but also what they believe members of their audience will also agree with and will be able to instinctively fill in as the missing parts of those arguments. So these implicit principles and value statements reveal something about the essential commitments of an arguer. And they also disclose something about the audience to whom the argument is addressed, because a speaker would not leave a premise unstated or implicit if he or she did not have confidence that the members of the audience would readily fill that in on their own from the resource of values and beliefs and commitments and experiences that they share with the speaker or the arguer. So we want to know whether those assumptions are warranted, or on the other hand, they might be begging the question. That is, a speaker or arguer might be assuming that an implicit premise is taken for granted by members of the audience, when in fact those missing premises remain contested and require additional evidence in support. So the warrants or inference statements that are often implicit because they're taken for granted by the arguer, and so these premises, we would say, go without saying, mainly because the arguer considers them fundamental or self-evident, and also then widely accepted by members of the audience. But the assumption of the truth of such statements may or may not be warranted. But still, the only way we can determine that is if we figure out what those missing premises are. So we want to be able to generate the missing premise to see whether, in fact, the speaker or arguer is right in taking them for granted or allowing them to go without saying. So to know something of the implicit or taken for granted principles and values of an arguer reveals something about that arguer's basic ideological commitments. And so in examining these missing premises, we may also reveal something about the ideological commitments that the arguer imagines he or she shares with the audience to whom those arguments are addressed. This idea in rhetorical criticism is referred to as the second persona. So one way to think about this is we could ask, who would it be that would respond to the argument? That is, who is the audience that's likely to fill in the missing premise that the speaker or the writer has left implicit or unstated? So this notion of the second persona refers to the implied audience of a discourse. If we think about the first person or the first persona, but the first person being the person speaking, and the second person, the person to whom the speaker is addressing his or her remarks, then we have this idea of the first persona and second persona. The first persona is what Aristotle would call ethos. That is, it's the image or character of the speaker that emerges from the discourse. It's the portrait we get of who the speaker is or who the speaker is attempting to be by the different signs and signals he or she gives in discourse regarding their background, their values, their beliefs, their experiences, and the like, and those things that they might share with members of an audience. So that's the first persona. In a sense, it's the characterization of the speaker in a discourse. But then the second persona is a similar idea, but it is the portrait that we get of the audience from a discourse. That is, who would the audience be that would be the kind of person or the kind of people who would readily insert the missing portions of an argument? That is, what kinds of values and beliefs would members of an audience have to make this argument work? So we begin by asking, who would respond to the argument? Who would instinctively fill in the missing premise of an argument? What kind of ideological commitments or values or shared experiences are required of the audience to whom the argument with the implicit premise is directed, right? So what does that audience have to know? What do they have to believe? What values do they have to possess in order to complete the argument? So the ideal audience for a discourse, that is the audience who would respond as the argument anticipates, is what we refer to as the second persona of the text. So we're not talking about any real historical people to whom a speech or an argument might be directed, but we're talking about the image of the audience that comes from understanding all of the components of the arguments in a text. This idea of second persona was introduced by Edwin Black, who was a rhetoric professor at the University of Wisconsin and one of my rhetoric professors there, in an article that he wrote in 1970 in the Quarterly Journal of Speech. And it was a way of approaching rhetorical criticism that enabled the critic to say something about the text and about the speaker because it revealed something about the audience that the speaker at least imagined the text was made for. So let's explain this again, this time in terms of what we might call rhetorical archaeology. So suppose you're digging in your garden and you discover an ancient urn, and inside that urn is a papyrus scroll. It's obviously thousands of years old, and the scroll is written in a language nobody knows, right? So you start out digging your carrots and you find this urn. It's got a scroll, and the scroll has a language, and nobody's ever seen this language before. So an expert in ancient languages determines that the words on the scroll are a speech, and then uses a translation program based on other ancient languages to translate that text into English. And it turns out the speech contains arguments. But you still don't know who wrote the speech. You don't know anything about the culture or the civilization that produced the scroll, and you know nothing about the audience to whom the speech was given, right? And so that's where you can apply this idea of the second persona to generate a portrait of that audience, to reveal something about the values and the beliefs of that culture based on the text alone. Okay? So you have that ancient scroll, you know it's a speech, it has arguments. Presumably the arguments also then have missing premises. So you assume the speaker knew his or her audience, and you assume that the speaker was trying to persuade the audience, because why do you engage in arguments if you're not trying to convince someone, right? So starting with these basic sort of common sense presumptions, right, that the speaker knew who the audience was and that the speaker was trying to persuade the audience with the text, with the arguments that you have, you work from the translation to find the missing premises of the speaker's argument. And now, where you started out with just this mysterious text, now you have some idea of the shared values and beliefs of the community for whom that text was meant, right? So you're using that rhetorical criticism, that rhetorical archaeology, to portray the second persona of the text. You can do this too with advertising. So if you take, let's say, a historical advertisement, here's an old advertisement for Lucky Strike cigarettes, right? You see in the ad, 20,679 physicians say Luckies are less irritating. It's toasted. But we also have the image of somebody who's apparently a doctor. He's in a white coat. He's holding up the cigarettes, sort of implicitly endorsing the cigarettes. But we also recognize, if we didn't know anything about the culture in which such an ad was portrayed, right, we would know for certain, at least, that doctors are considered credible sources of advice, that doctors are trusted, that those would be unstated or implicit values or beliefs that exist in the culture and which are necessary to make an ad like this work, right? Same kind of thing, a little bit more recent ad, but an ad for phone networks, right? Phone plans. And here it's the lowest call rate is the main appeal. And so you would say, okay, well, this would come from a particular culture, a particular community in which there was perhaps a competition for or among different phone plans, and it would be addressed to a culture who would see an issue like the price or the rate as being a fundamental or core value that they would seek from various phone plans. Unstated in here, of course, would be the taken for granted value or the taken for granted assumption that paying less for a service is better than paying more. That's not stated anywhere in the ad, but we can clearly see that value at work in completing the thought or the appeal of the ad. Here's a couple of more examples, right? A very old ad for a certain kind of baking flour. You can easily make lighter, whiter, and finer cakes with swan's down cake flour. You will never realize your fondest hopes in cake baking until you use swan's down. Well, there's so many things here in an ad like this that reveal things about the culture in which an ad like this was intended to work. It tells us something about maybe the relative status of men and women in the culture. It tells us the sort of commercial values that get promoted, the idea that something is easier or that something is finer. Those are seen as goods, and these are promoted because they're connected to the particular product. Again, we can use advertising archaeology to reveal something about the audience, the community, the market of people to whom an ad like this might be addressed. Here's another ad. It takes 90 years to grow a box of Kleenex, right? A kind of advocacy ad for an environmental cause. But again, you see both with the image and with the slogan here, right? There are at work certain core values that the advertiser assumes that members of the audience will accept as agreeable or something to which they also have a commitment, and that's reinforced in both words and images by the advertiser Greenpeace. So how do we find the missing premise? To do that, we want to go through 8 steps. And the first step is when you read the natural language argument, find the conclusion. Now remember from earlier exercises in the class, one of the things we can do to find the conclusion is to look for those argument indicators which tell us which statement is the claim of the argument. So see if you can find the conclusion of the natural language argument. And then based on that, identify the evidence statement. We know that an evidence statement in a syllogism is a premise. And so we start with the conclusion and the given premise, that is the premise that is explicit in the natural language argument. So now you're just identifying the parts of the argument that will be translated into standard logical form and into syllogistic form. Then after you identified the parts, translate both the conclusion statement and the premise into standard two-term form statement. Okay? Translate into standard logical form, and then mark the types of statements after your translation. So now do you have universal affirmatives, universal negatives, particular affirmatives, or particular negatives? And arrange those statements, the 2 statements that you have, that is the 2 statements that are explicit in the natural language argument, arrange those into syllogistic form. So you've translated them into standard logical form. Now put them in the right place, the conclusion at the bottom under the line, and then the evidence statement or premise above the line. Then apply the rules of inference, and you apply the rules of inference as the way of generating the missing premise. So you know, for instance, if the conclusion statement that you've identified and put into standard logical form is a negative statement, and the premise that you've identified is an affirmative, you would know, for example, that the missing premise would have to be negative in order to generate a valid syllogism. So you use those rules of inference to generate the missing premise, and then once you do that, you can just test it and make sure you've created a valid syllogism. So let's look at a few examples, and I think the process of generating missing premises will become clearer as we work through these examples and apply these steps to different natural language arguments. So here's the first example, and in natural language, the argument says, a few of the yard sale items were valuable, so it is clear they were worth the trip. So as you read this, you're trying to translate this natural language sentence into an argument in standard logical form. And you recognize that even though you have one sentence, you actually have two statements that are parts of the argument. And you recognize the argument indicator so, which tells you the second statement is the claim of the natural language argument, and that's what you want to translate into the conclusion of the syllogism. And then you take the first statement, a few of the yard sale items were valuable, that's the evidence statement in the natural language argument, and that's what you're translating into the premise of the syllogism. So let's do that and translate into standard logical form. So we take the premise or the evidence statement here, and it's a few of the yard sale items. A few tells us it's particular, so it's going to be some. And a few of the yard sale items were valuable. That's affirmative. So we have a particular affirmative statement, the subject term yard sale items, and the predicate term valuable, or we'll add the noun valuable finds. So the premise is some yard sale items are valuable finds. That's the explicit or given premise of the syllogism. And then we go to the second statement, the conclusion or the claim of the natural language argument, which becomes the conclusion of the syllogism. So it is clear they were worth the trip. The they refers to the same yard sale items, and we're still talking about the same few items. So it's another particular, and they were worth the trip, so it's another affirmative. So we have another particular affirmative statement. So the conclusion would be the two-term statement in standard logical form, some yard sale items are worthy purchases. Now that gives us what we have, what is given explicitly in the natural language argument. But we also know there's a part of the argument missing. That is, there's an assumption at work that members of the audience will fill in that warrant statement or inference statement, which allows a move from the premise to acceptance of the necessary conclusion. So our job here is to generate that missing premise, even though it's nowhere given explicitly in the natural language argument. So what is the missing premise, and how do we find it? Okay. So here's a few of the yard sale items that were valuable, so it's clear they were worth the trip. Here's the parts that we've translated so far into standard logical form. We have the conclusion and the first premise. So the first question we could ask is the missing premise affirmative or negative? Well, you can answer that question by applying the rules of inference, right? If you look at the conclusion, it's an affirmative conclusion. What do you know about the rule of equal negation? The number of negative premises must equal the number of negative conclusions. Here you have 0 negative conclusions because the conclusion is affirmative. So you know that missing premise is going to be affirmative, right? So we can put the A there to mark that this will be an affirmative statement when it finally appears. An affirmative conclusion means the missing premise must be affirmative, because if you had a negative missing premise, you would commit the fallacy of unequal negation. So you apply that rule of equal negation to get a valid syllogism, and that will generate an affirmative missing premise. Then you can go to the middle term and apply the rule of middle distribution. Will the middle term be distributed or not? So we find the middle term by noting which terms are the end terms, because the middle term is not going to be in the conclusion. So we know the end terms are yard sale items and worthy purchases. So valuable finds must be the middle term because it's the term that's not in the conclusion. But then apply the rule of middle distribution. Middle terms must be distributed once and only once. And in this case, you have valuable finds in the given premise. You have valuable finds in the predicate position of an affirmative statement. So that means valuable finds is not distributed in the given premise. And so middle terms must be distributed once and only once, which tells you when it reappears in the missing premise, it must be in a position where it is distributed in order to have a valid syllogism. So we could ask, okay, well, what kind of an affirmative statement gives me a term that is distributed? And the answer, of course, is it has to be a universal affirmative. And I know then valuable finds, the middle term, must appear in the subject term position of that universal affirmative statement, right? So I would place that middle term, valuable finds, in the subject position of the missing premise, which I know now is a universal affirmative statement. And I know it must be distributed because middle terms must be distributed once and only once, and it's not distributed in the given premise. So it goes in the subject position of a universal affirmative because that's where it gives us a distributed term. So then I can move on to the rule of equal distribution. Here's what I have so far in generating the missing premise, and I can turn to the end terms. So I have one end term that appears twice already, and that's yard sale items. And if I apply the rule of equal distribution, I see that yard sale items is not distributed in the conclusion, and it's also not distributed in the first premise, and that's equal distribution, and that's okay. But I also see that I have another end term, worthy purchases, and that appears only once so far in the conclusion. So I know this is going to be the missing term of the missing premise, right? So what's the missing end term? It's worthy purchases. And will it be equally distributed? So if I look at it in the conclusion, it is not distributed, which means when it reappears, it must also be not distributed. And indeed, if I fill it in here in that bracket that's empty, added in as the predicate term of the missing premise, it would not be distributed because it would be the predicate term of an affirmative, right? And so if I apply the rule of inference for end terms, and I take that second end term, worthy purchases, it's not distributed in the conclusion and also not distributed in the missing premise, and that's fine, right? Worthy purchases becomes the missing term. It must be in an undistributed position. And so when we put it there, we end up with a valid syllogism, a syllogism that passes all the rules of inference. So here's another example. Several of the students were not watching the video lectures and so cannot be expected to pass the third quiz. Hope that's not true, but let's take this natural language argument. Several of the students were not watching the video lectures and so cannot be expected to pass the third quiz, right? And translate that into standard logical form. We have one sentence but two statements again. We have the argument indicator so, which tells us the second statement is the conclusion. It's cannot, and that gives us the clue that it's a negative, right? It's several of the students, and that tells us not all, but particular. And we also have with the first premise another negative, right? So if we translate that into standard logical form, we could do this as the premise would be some students are not video watchers, a particular negative. And then that leads to the conclusion, some students are not third quiz passers, another particular negative. So let's go through the steps to generate the missing premise here. We have some students are not video watchers, and therefore Some students are not third quiz passers. But what's the missing premise? If we apply the rule of equal negation, we notice that we have a negative conclusion and also already one negative premise. And that will tell us that the missing premise must be affirmative, because if you have a second negative premise, you will commit the fallacy of unequal negation. So we know the missing premise is going to be affirmative. And then we can look at the middle term. And the middle term we note is video watchers. And how do we know that? Because it's in the premise, but it's not in the conclusion. So it will also be in the second premise. So video watchers is the middle term, but the rule for middle terms is middle terms must be distributed once and only once. And in this case, it appears as the predicate of a negative, so it's already distributed, which means when that middle term reappears, it must be in a position where it is not distributed, because middle terms must be distributed once and only once, and this one is already distributed once. So we know that the missing premise is affirmative, and we know that predicates of affirmatives are not distributed, so we could drop down that middle term to the predicate position of the missing premise, and that would put it in a position as the predicate of an affirmative where it is not distributed, and then we would avoid the fallacy of maldistributed middle. Then we can go to the end terms, and the end term students already appears twice, so we know the missing term is third quiz passers. Students, if we apply that test of equal distribution, students is not distributed in the first premise and not distributed in the conclusion, and that's fine. But third quiz passers, which is the other and the missing end term, third quiz passers is distributed in the conclusion because it's predicate of a negative, which means when it reappears in the missing premise, it must be in a position where it is distributed also, because end terms have to be equally distributed. And so that tells us that the missing premise is not only affirmative, but it's universal affirmative, because if I put third quiz passers as the subject of a universal, it will then be distributed. And so our final or valid syllogism is, as appears here, the missing premise, all third quiz passers are video watchers. But then here's another correct solution. Suppose that you start with the statement, some students are non-video watchers. That is, you start with the complementary term of the predicate of that first premise, right? And that's an affirmative statement because it's are non-video watchers. So we have a particular affirmative, and then also we retain the particular negative conclusion. And if we have a particular negative conclusion, then we know the missing premise must be negative in order to avoid the fallacy of unequal negation. And so if the missing premise is negative, we also then can go to the other rules, the rule of middle distribution. Non-video watchers is not distributed now in the first premise, which means it must be distributed when it reappears. And again, if we know that second premise is negative, we could drop it down into the predicate position because predicates of negatives are distributed. But we'll leave it where it is for now because we also want to look at the end terms, and we take that end term third quiz passers. It is distributed in the conclusion because it's predicate of a negative, which tells us it must also be distributed in the missing premise. So now we can deduce the type of statement that the missing premise would be, because it has to be a statement that gives us two distributed terms. Non-video watchers, we know, must be distributed, and third quiz passers must also be distributed. And the only kind of statement that gives us two distributed terms is the universal negative. And so if you did it this way and ended up with no non-video watchers are third quiz passers, or you could say no third quiz passers are non-video watchers, those would also be correct solutions, or the generation of a correct missing premise, because in each case you would get a valid syllogism. And of course you'll note that those options as depicted here are logical equivalents to the missing premise in the previous possible solution. They're equivalent statements. That is, they express the same relationship between the categories represented by the terms. So here's another example. None of the juniors had read the assigned notes. As a result, they'll all be unable to complete the homework exercise. So we would translate that. Here we have two sentences, but we'll make them into two statements. None of the juniors had read the assigned notes. As a result, and there's the argument indicator, they'll all be unable to complete the homework exercise. That tells us that's the conclusion. So we would have a universal negative as the premise. None tells us it's universal negative. No juniors are notes readers. And we can have the conclusion, all juniors are homework disabled. However, as it says here, what's wrong with this syllogism? If you notice, we've just generated a statement in the conclusion which is affirmative and a premise which is negative. So if we try to go forward from here, we will create an invalid syllogism because the conclusion is affirmative and the premise is negative, but you must have an equal number of negative premises and conclusions. So how do we fix that? Okay. We could obvert the statement, right? So instead of having no juniors are notes readers, we could obvert and get all juniors are non-notes readers, and then we have an affirmative statement which eliminates the possibility of doing unequal negation, the unequal negation fallacy. And this is why we learn things like obversion and contraposition. So here we have both the statement in standard logical form with the obverted replacement, and then also the generation of the missing premise. All juniors are non-notes readers. All juniors are homework disabled. How did we get there? If you take all juniors are homework disabled as the conclusion, right, then you know juniors and homework disabled people are the end terms. The middle term would have to be non-notes readers. Non-notes readers is not distributed in the first premise, which means it would have to be distributed when it appears in the missing premise. So you know it's going to be a universal affirmative with that term as the subject term, which makes it distributed. So all non-notes readers becomes a distributed term in the missing premise. And then juniors already appears twice, but homework disabled does not. So that has to be the missing term in the missing premise. And it's not distributed in the conclusion. So it also must not be distributed where it appears in the missing premise. And so the final missing premise would be all non-notes readers are homework disabled. But then here's another correct solution. If we go back and have no juniors are notes readers, we could also obvert the conclusion statement to make it negative, which means that missing premise is going to be a universal affirmative. And we know that because you can't have two negative premises. But again, we end up with a missing premise that's the logical equivalent of the other missing premises, because the logical relations are the same. So in this case, if you start by obverting the conclusion instead of the given premise, you would end up with a conclusion that says no juniors are non-homework disabled. That would tell you that you have to have an affirmative missing premise, because that missing premise can't be negative. You must avoid unequal negation. You have the middle term as notes readers. It is distributed in the first premise because it's predicate of a negative, so it must be not distributed in the missing premise, and we know that predicates of affirmatives are not distributed, so we move notes readers into that predicate position. Juniors already appears twice, so the missing term is non-homework disabled. It is distributed in the conclusion, which means it must also be distributed in the missing premise, so it goes in the subject position of a universal affirmative statement. So if you have any questions on generating missing premises or on the steps to follow to get the missing premise, then by all means post them to the discussion board, and we'll be doing more exercises, more examples, both on exercise 17 and on exercise 18. I can even give you additional practice examples for missing premises.